The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Talk of the Bay on this Thursday evening, June 15th, on your amazing and wonderful community radio station, KSQD.org. This is your host, Ami Chen Mills, and I am so excited to welcome Andrea Chalupa to the show today. I just want to check in with Andrea and see if she is live and connected. Are you there, Andrea?
Yes, Andrea's here. I'm excited to join you.
I know. I'm so thrilled. Andrea Chalupa is joining us from New York. She is the co-host of the podcast Gaslit Nation, a journalist and the author of Orwell and the Refugees, The Untold Story of Animal Farm. She has written for Time, The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, and Forbes magazine. She is a founder of Digital Maidan, an online movement that made the Ukrainian protests the #1 trending topic on Twitter worldwide. She produced and wrote the film Mr. Jones about the intrepid young Welsh journalist Gareth Jones and his investigation of Stalin's Holodomor.
Holodomor.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I always think of Voldemort when I Voldemort.
Close.
When I right.
Yeah, Stalin's famine. Yeah, Voldemort. Yeah, Voldemort. Yeah,
very close. In Nature, the forced famine and genocide in Ukraine, helping inspire George Orwell's Animal Farm, the book that made him famous. Andrea's parents were born in displaced persons camps in 1945 Europe. The hellish machine of the Soviet Union that her parents escaped has been one of Chalupa's major preoccupations for the past decade, leading her to discover a priceless gift from George Orwell in her family. We're going to get into that. She is the co-author with Sarah Kendzior, who wrote The View from Flyover Country and They Knew of the just-released book. This is a newly released book by the two of them called Dictatorship. It's easier than you think. We're going to jump into this conversation with Andrea in just a second, but I know that the Ukrainian war, which is actually the Russian war against Ukraine, has been controversial in our community. I want people to know that they can call in with their questions. Now, I just first want to thank Andrea for being here and also for her amazing podcast with Sarah Kendzior called Gaslit Nation. Andrea, I want to tell you that you have a story with Sarah that I would like for you to tell, but I have a similar story with a girlfriend of mine who we just were holding hands during the 2016 election. When we couldn't sleep, we had adrenaline running through our bodies, and then we became activists together. And you have a similar story. Do you want to just share that story about how you and Sarah started the Gaslit Nation podcast?
Yeah, I think it started actually because Sarah and I were sort of these lone voices on the progressive left who saw very clearly what the Kremlin was doing in 2016, all the stuff documented ultimately in the 400-page Mueller report.
Yeah.
Because for years, a decade plus, my focus was Ukraine's history, past and present. I'd studied at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. I had lived in Ukraine for 5 months in 2005, following the Orange Revolution, a popular uprising that forced a corrupt, stolen election to be redone, with a clean election being held that elected a democratic, safe candidate, like a solid candidate, and
right.
And so all my years in watching Kremlin aggression in Ukraine, how corruption gets weaponized, the golden handcuffs of politicians and operatives who were purchased by the West. Western operatives who would go to countries like Ukraine to make their money, blood money, helping tyrants clean up, wannabe tyrants clean up and come to power.
Mm-hmm. Like Paul Manafort comes to mind.
Yeah, Paul Manafort became Trump's longtime. Paul Manafort, who is a longtime Kremlin operative in Ukraine, and who was also Trump's longtime friend and neighbor, and ran Trump's campaign in 2016 for president for free because he needed to get straight. He owed some money to a Russian oligarch, and this was his way of repaying him. And so all of that is to say that I was very close in watching Ukraine and seeing everything, how it was this petri dish, this laboratory for Kremlin aggression, and to see the same operation from election hacking to a divide and conquer strategy of culture wars, like really driving culture wars, disinformation, propaganda, controlled opposition, oligarchs, wielding their power. The whole Kremlin clown car that helped bring the Ukrainian Trump, Viktor Yanukovych, to power was now being used to bring our Trump to power in 2016. And it was very scary. And Sarah saw instantly what was happening too very early on because of her own work in former Soviet-occupied states and Central. Her focus was Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and countries that are stuck under Moscow's orbit. And it's the same playbook across that whole entire region, Eastern Europe and the Central Asian states, countries that have had their language banned, their culture banned, their leading intellectuals, their leading thinkers liquidated, arrested. That's how Russian imperialism has worked for centuries. And the Soviet Union was just another name for Russian imperialism. Putin, Yeltsin, what they did post collapse of the Soviet Union is just they went to work right away with Russian imperialism first in raising Chechnya with their 2 wars in Chechnya, then Moldova, invading parts of Georgia, propping up the mass murdering dictator Assad and his family in Syria. Yeah. And they did that for the Russians to finally secure a major military base on the Mediterranean, which they now use to deepen their imperialism across Africa, as we've seen with destabilizing Sudan now in recent months with propping up their proxies there, and a lot of the ruthless atrocities that they're committing right now, the Russians, across several African countries, including their mercenaries raping women in a maternity leave who had just given birth. I believe that was in Kar. All of those atrocities that they're carrying out, including shooting some Chinese nationals, because Russia and China are in this competitive relationship in Africa. All the stuff that the horrific crimes against humanity that Russia has been carrying out in several African nations to advance their imperial interests, acting essentially as a police force, a terror police force for the Chinese who are coming in and buying up a bunch of land, entrenching themselves financially through their own version of imperialism, but including exporting Chinese surveillance technology to places like Uganda. But so Uganda, everything that the Russians have been doing in Africa, it's been allowing them to grab natural resources like diamond mines, gold mines, and so on in Africa to evade sanctions and further funnel money into their war machine and prop up their war efforts. So that's really important for folks to know. And so I kind of gave you a big old overview, but Sarah and I sort of met in 2016. Mm-hmm. The whole joke was that James Comey was throwing the election to the Russians because he's just such a misogynist, couldn't stand Hillary Clinton, and was playing into the hands to the Russians and Giuliani and the whole Trump clown car that way. And the New York Times was getting the story wrong, publishing an article saying that the FBI sees no clear link between Trump and Russia. And obviously the Mueller report proved that wrong. And it just seemed like the media, with Jeff Zucker giving endless airtime to Trump, even putting a CNN camera, live feed on a podium, anticipating his arrival like he was Elvis. Right. So we really joined forces in those horrific final hours of the 2016 election and came together to fight back and to fact check and ungaslight the gaslighting and really call out and be very early on all the major points that Robert Mueller would ultimately make in his investigation. And we paid a price for it. We got a hit piece in Kushner's Observer. The Kremlin was running hit pieces on us. It was on and on and on. And people on the far left would call us a bunch of Hillary Clinton shills, or we're making excuses for why Hillary lost. And then people on the far right would do the same. And we were just joking that we had enemies left, right, and center. Like, and I will say for today, I know every podcast now sounds like Gaslit Nation. They're warning about, Trump is an authoritarian. He's the far right in America. They want to turn America into a dictatorship. Every podcast now sounds like Gaslit Nation. When we launched in 2018 with that warning, we launched with 3 episodes that looked at the 2016 election like a crime scene. We went into how the media was complicit in helping Trump come to power. We went into how the FBI was complicit in helping Trump come to power, and so on and so on. And we were really expecting to be destroyed. We expected it to rain hit pieces again on us. And instead, Gaslit Nation went viral because we were finally saying what needed to be said. And we were 2 friends helping each other through this unimaginable time and trying to help people understand what we're living through, using examples from history, using examples of dictators coming to power, how the press is complicit in that, how the press was complicit, and elite business leaders were complicit in appointing, helping Hitler come to power, and so on, and really helping people stay grounded in history as a guide, and helping people stay grounded in understanding how Kremlin aggression worked in Ukraine as a guide, and why Ukraine matters, and why Ukraine was so central to understanding where the U.S. could be headed. And because Trump and Russia wanted a satellite state in the U.S., they wanted to appoint Trump as their guy for democracy to fall in the U.S., and for the U.S. to be taken out of the game globally, and America would just become some puppet state, as we saw in the 2019 Helsinki Hell Summit between Trump and Putin, how gleeful Putin looked. And that's what Putin wants for Ukraine, for Ukraine to be his, for the U.S. to be his. Like, he wants, it's Russian imperialism, and it doesn't stop unless it is stopped.
Yeah.
So Sarah and I met in the back. That was where we came from.
Yeah,
about that.
That's a mouthful, but it's also important because we have been faced with. I mean, what I'm hearing from you is like. And the reason why your title of your podcast, Gaslit Nation, is so great is we have been facing a flood tide. It's like we're swimming upstream, not just from, the right wing and the GOP at this time, but also in my mind from a lot of leftists and people who are sort of Russian friendly and Russian savvy, Russian, I don't know how to put it, but they, and we're going to get into that because we know there's also a history of U.S. imperialism around the world. So it gets very confusing. It's very difficult to keep everything straight. And I just want to remind everybody that we are on KSQD 90.7 FM in the Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay area. And we are speaking with Andrea Chalupa, who is the author of a new book that's just come out called Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think. She's also the co-host of the Gaslit Nation podcast and the producer and writer for the film Mr. Jones on Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. We are taking phone calls at 831-900-KSQD. That's 831-900-5773. You can also text a question there or a comment, and you can email us at onair@ksqd.org. So, Andrea, I wanted to back up a little bit because you are Ukrainian American, born in Sacramento. You went to UC Davis, which is not too far from where we are right now. And I think like my first introduction to Ukraine at all as a somewhat, ignorant American was looking into Paul Manafort. I remember hearing, I'm like, what is Paul Manafort doing in Ukraine? What the heck is that? And that's when I started to untangle things. But I think a lot of people don't understand the history of Ukraine, and there are comments about, well, Ukraine's always been a part of Russia, sort of like Russian talking points coming to the foreground right now. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of background on not going too into detail, but, like a brief history of Ukraine and Russia and the 2004 revolution, the Maidan Revolution, and then the invasion by Russia, because I think a lot of people just don't understand the chronology of what's happened in Ukraine, and also what Manafort was doing there in 2014.
So, Amy, when we have guests on Gaslit Nation, we let them rip. we just had Cory Doctorow on, and it was like Sarah and I were just sitting back.
Yeah.
And like letting Cory go. But I understand. I'll keep my answers as short as possible.
No. It's fine. I just want to make sure we get everything in. We only have an hour.
The short answer is watch my film, Mr. Jones. It was directed by 3-time Academy Award nominee Agnieszka Holland, who directed Europa, the story of a Jewish boy who hides in Hitler's youth to survive. She directed the first original version of The Secret Garden, the superior version. She's done a ton of television like The Wire, The Affair, House of Cards. Agnieszka was born and raised in Soviet-occupied Poland. Her father and mother were both journalists. Her father's official cause of death was jumping out of the window, dying by suicide while under police interrogation. So she put a lot of her own personal stories of growing up under Soviet occupation into Mr. Jones. That's why the film feels so authentic. And we had a team of historians on that film, including Timothy Snyder, who wrote Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, how those two mass murderers influenced each other. And Mr. Jones starts in a crossroads of a year that changes the world, much like 2020. And that was 1933, when Hitler comes to power as chancellor and immediately starts building his first concentration camp. And within 6 months, Germany is a dictatorship. And then Stalin gets away with mass murdering millions of Ukrainians in a famine in order to kill as many Ukrainians as possible and colonize the land and take it for himself, and over time rebuild that area into Russians. And that's why eastern Ukraine, the hardest hit parts of Ukraine by the famine, are Russian-speaking today, because those Russians were brought in over time to repopulate the area that was decimated by Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. And that's very important to understand, because when Putin began his invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, he justified it as he was going in to liberate the Russian speakers. And that was very clear that he was building off of Stalin's legacy. And anyone that studies genocides, a lot like the genocide of Native Americans and the genocide of slavery that built America and so on, knows that genocides begin and are kept going through hate speech and through very clear, proud, romanticized genocidal intent. And what the Soviets did in the lead up to their genocide famine in Ukraine in 1933 was make it very clear that Ukrainians had to die. They scapegoated them. They turned them into an enemy. They would show the Soviet state produced movies of showing Ukrainian farmers as locusts, and that they were destroying the crop. They were enemies of the people. They were putting up a fierce resistance to Stalin's 5-year plans of collectivization and really rallying and inciting violence, like what we saw on January 6th in our country, inciting violence and justifying violence. And Stalin and his agents went into Ukraine. They seized the country's agriculture. They even destroyed what people had to feed themselves. I interviewed survivors of this famine. One woman reported how she and her brothers were boiling leaves and sticks and mud over an open fire in a pot to try to feed themselves. That's what people ate to get through and to survive. And a Soviet agent came and grabbed the pot and dumped it upside down, pouring it out, because they wanted people to die. The Soviets didn't have a nuclear bomb in 1933, so what's the most efficient way available at that time to kill as many people as possible?
Can I ask you?
And that was by engineering a famine.
Can I ask you what the roots are of this kind of genocidal intent on Ukraine? Because I know there's a whole history.
Money, colonization.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
It's not just money. It's also how do I say this? So even before the Soviet period, right, you had empires, right? You had these great empires. Russia was a great empire, and Ukraine was the agricultural breadbasket that was supposed to just feed the empire. And shut up, stop complaining, and you serfs were enslaved people. The only thing you're good for is working the land and feeding the empire. And you don't need to read. You don't need to ask for your rights. You don't need to develop your minds and become a great culture, great country. You guys can just stay subservient to us. And the real empire, the real culture, the real glory was in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and that was the mentality of the time. And but Ukrainians saw it differently, because Kiev is was the way Ukrainians see their own history is it's important to understand how Ukrainians see themselves, because we have to give the target of the genocide, the victim of today's genocide, agency. And the way Ukrainians see themselves is they come from a culture, a history centuries older than Russia. Kiev is considered the Jerusalem of the Slavs, when Moscow didn't even exist, when it was just some wild backwater for centuries. There was a bustling, influential kingdom known as Kiev Rus, and they would marry their princesses and princes to the royal houses across the rest of Europe, France, the Franks, and so on, countries like that. I'm going to get the names of those kingdoms wrong, but it was a significant period of history. It had influence in its own right, high literacy rates, relatively good rights for women at the time, and a proud culture. And Moscow developed over time. Muscovy developed over time. They would bring in priests and professors, teachers from intellectual leaders or so on from Kiev to help develop Muscovy. And over time, Muscovy grew bigger and bigger, and it appropriated Kiev's own history by taking the name of Kiev's own kingdom, Kiev Rus, by calling itself Rus, Russia.
Wow.
Yeah, and so Ukraine was always like, wait a minute, we're the big brother. We were here first. We're older than you. We've been around the block. You're this fiery teenager that's now using violence and oppression and propaganda and a police force to now capture us and turn us into your slave. And that's what the Russian Empire did. And it just continued on in a different form in the Soviet Empire, but the brutality was even greater because you had just sadists at the top. Like, don't get me started on Stalin's henchman, Beria, who would kidnap people, like girls mostly, off the street and do experiments on them. Like, he was a pure sadist. And one thing that people have to understand, and that we talk about on Gaslit Nation and we discuss in our book, Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think, is that the way dictators come to power and stay in power is through their terror force, their base. All dictators need a base. Putin has a base. Trump has a base. You cannot wield power without your base. And your base is a calling card for sadists to come together and to unleash their inner beast. For instance, there's a reason why a lot of members of the police in America are pro-Trump, and they wave those blue Trumpian flags. And so when you have these execution videos, these modern-day lynchings of black people being shot point blank by the police, and Trump and his crowd coming to their defense, the Kyle Rittenhouses, the Zimmermans, and so on, those executions are recruitment tools. Those what are heartbreaking videos to us, they are recruitment tools for the dictator's base, for the dictator's movement, saying, like, if you want to get away with lynchings, come join us. We'll protect you. We'll back you up. We'll turn you into a martyr. You can literally get away with murder, like Kyle Rittenhouse and so on. And so that's a very common dynamic for dictatorships, how they function and want to be dictatorships. And in the Soviet Union, that place was ran by sadists. My grandfather, for instance, he left behind a memoir for me that he wrote in Ukrainian, and he described being a young father arrested during Stalin's Great Terror and being tortured in prison, and described what that torture was like, what was done to him. This would only be carried out by sadists. Right. And this same level of inhumanity is being carried out today in occupied areas of Ukraine under Russian control. And so when people say in the West, as well-meaning as they are, we need to have an off-ramp for Putin, we need to negotiate peace with Putin. We've been trying since this war began in 2014. There were all sorts of off-ramps given. There are all sorts of moments of paying Putin all the respect he craves. He had a summit on the world stage with presidents of the United States, Trump and then Biden. He hosted the Olympics. He's been a big man on the world stage for so long, while France and Germany were trying to give him land for peace, even if Ukraine had reservations around that, and trying to give him a greater oversight over parts of Ukraine in exchange for peace. And it went nowhere. He still launched a total genocidal invasion that's ongoing today. And the Russians had been very clear about what they want to do in Ukraine. It's one of those legal cases where the criminals keep telling you what their intent is over and over and over again, as they do on state TV. They're saying, we want to wipe out all Ukrainians. We want to kill them all. We want to kidnap their children and force them to speak Russian, be Russian now. These are all acts of genocide. And I want people to understand we've tried to appease Putin. We've tried it, and it did not work, just like it didn't work with Hitler. And no one wants a war. No one wants to go to war. At the very least, we need to give Ukraine everything it needs to defend itself and to end this militarily, because one thing that weakens a strong man like Putin is a military defeat, a decisive military defeat. And when you have that, it shows the rest of Russians, his base, that the emperor has no clothes on, the emperor is actually weak, and that he did something incredibly foolish by launching this total war, which he's decisively lost, and Ukraine remains independent, and Ukraine remains a democracy, and Ukraine remains a safe haven for human rights activists, including LGBTQ activists in that region, and Ukraine remains a multicultural democracy where people can go and publish the books they want to publish, speak in the languages they want to speak in. And there's even now Ukrainian soldiers who are openly gay serving in the military, and you have civic activists who are leading the push for gay marriage in Ukraine, which would be a huge step in that part of the world. And that is ultimately why Ukraine is such a threat to Russia.
It's amazing to have you on. You have so much information. And honestly, I wouldn't interrupt you, except we also have to do station breaks. So we're going to take a station break. We're here with Andrea Chalupa. She is the co-host of the podcast Gaslit Nation. She has just released with Sarah Kendzior the book Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think. She's an expert on Ukraine and Russia. We're going to go to break. We'll come right back with Andrea Chalupa. And we actually have a recording of a little bit of your podcast with the Ukrainian ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch. You just interviewed her a couple weeks ago, so we're going to play a little piece from that.
A gotcha moment in their case that the Democrats were working with elements of Ukraine to try to get President Trump to basically flip the script on the Russia investigation of Trump. Right? You were sort of part of that larger conspiracy theory web that Giuliani and Trump were trying to spin to try to go after the investigators that were going after them, or to really make Trump seem like the victim, basically.
Yeah, that could be the case. I think we still don't know the full story, but I think the most important issue was that there was a plan that Giuliani had where he wanted the Ukrainian government to prosecute Joe Biden, former vice president at that time, Joe Biden and his son, for activities in Ukraine. And they wanted to dig up dirt that they could use in what they rightly anticipated would be a campaign for the U.S. presidency against Joe Biden. And so they were looking for dirt wherever they could. And they thought, Giuliani had said this, that I would stand in the way. And so I think they wanted to make sure that there was nobody at the U.S. Embassy that would somehow stand in the way of their schemes.
And it seemed like a lot of women kept standing in the way of their schemes. Like during the Trump years, there's so many women, like Sally Yates and others, putting themselves in the line of fire by just doing their jobs.
So that's the interview with Marie Yovanovitch on the podcast Gaslit Nation that is co-hosted by our guest today on Talk of the Bay, Andrea Chalupa. a recent co-author of Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think. And so with this interview, we're sort of moving into the mess, as you say, the clown show often on your podcast, of what's been happening in the United States that has been sort of the tentacles of Putin, reaching over here. And I think part of the disbelief about all of that has to do with, and tell me what you think about this, American exceptionalism. It's hard to believe that Russia could get away with so much in the United States. And you and Sarah document, so much Russian interference, funding of people like George Santos. And, that was where I first heard that Santos had Russian oligarch funding actually during his campaign. Do you want to talk more? I'd love for you to talk more actually about how the Russians have influenced, we kind of know about Trump now, but are there things you think we don't know? I mean, I've heard that, the Russians actually were funding the Democrats to some extent, and I heard that also on Gaslit Nation. But my understanding now is mostly the GOP. Can you give us sort of like a big picture on that, what's going on there?
Yeah, it's simply put, it's Russia's idiots are aligned with our idiots. and that's what makes the situation so dangerous. It's a bunch of idiots run amok on the global stage. And I want to talk about John Gunther, this journalist of the interwar period, who was covering both the rise of Hitler and Stalinism. And he saw no difference between Hitler and Stalin. He's like, it's fascism, it's totalitarianism, it's fascism. And the Nazis, of course, famously went to America to study the Jim Crow South in building Nazism and building a genocide and using legal warfare. And so we have to think of Russia's influence in the United States as Russian fascists are aligned with American fascists, and they are doing this through dark money. They're doing this through their bot operation. The same, are we allowed to swear? The same guy who is the same Russian oligarch.
We're not allowed
to
swear, just so you know.
Well, I'm caught myself.
You did.
And so the same Russian oligarch in the Russian elite who is in charge of Wagner, a Russian mercenary group that is a instrument of the Kremlin. Wagner sends their Russian mercenaries across Africa, Syria, Ukraine, of course. This same guy who runs Wagner, his name is Prigozhin. I kid you not, he has the face of a piranha. Like his teeth are all teeth. Your teeth can be whatever you want, but if you have a darkened soul and you look like a piranha, it's worth being called out. If you have a beautiful soul, it's going to show. It's going to shine through, teeth and all. But so Prigozhin, this Russian oligarch that runs Wagner, he is very proud and has openly taken credit that his troll factories were instrumental in helping Trump come to power in 2016 by sowing chaos, by turning Americans, by lighting a match on the gasoline of our existing problems and turning Americans against each other. The same sort of strategy the Kremlin employed in Ukraine to bring their Trump, Yanukovych, to power. And so with George Santos specifically, George Santos, the whiz kid that he is, he was part of a Florida-based Ponzi scheme that was under investigation. He was one of the last men standing at this Ponzi scheme, there till the bitter end. And he was given something like hundreds of thousands of dollars by a financier who is the cousin of an extremely influential Russian oligarch close to Putin. And this particular Russian oligarch, his name is Vekselberg, his assignment for the Kremlin was to use his massive stolen fortune to go to the West and tell MIT and other leading American institutions that he was being tasked with building a Russian Silicon Valley. So let's unite, let's get to work, let's do a bunch of wonderful initiatives. Let's get entangled, basically. And what he was really doing was spreading Russian influence and through Russian stolen wealth and making respectable places like MIT dependent or feeding from this trough of dirty Russian money. And meanwhile, the FBI, someone I believe in the FBI Boston office, rang the alarm saying this guy is spreading a Russian influence campaign. He's here to basically steal state secrets, find vulnerabilities, cultivate useful idiots, cultivate assets that the Kremlin can employ, and so on. And so he's been sanctioned, needless to say. And his cousin would go on to give hundreds of thousands of dollars to George Santos, and Santos would lose it in a Florida Ponzi scheme. And he was ultimately rewarded for doing this. When Santos ran for Congress soon after this, and the Russian oligarch's cousin was like, well, you just lost like $500,000 or so of my money in a Ponzi scheme. Sure, I'll give you tens of thousands of dollars to run for Congress. That sounds like a great idea. Mm-hmm. And so it's very clear, given how the Russians operate, that George Santos was on the hook. George Santos was seen as useful and like somebody that they could work with because he had no morals, and he was somebody that could be their guy, and they got him into Congress. And just the fact, and what would he do in Congress for the Russians? He'd vote the Russians' way, as he has been doing, being against the war in Ukraine and so on, and being pro Trump. And it's also an embarrassment to the United States that somebody backed by Russian-linked money could get to the halls of power like that.
Yeah.
And he's also, needless to say, linked to Bannon. Bannon is very mobbed up with Russian influence campaigns, given that he's very outspoken about the same ideologies of hate and anti-democracy as Putin and his guys, anti-LGBTQ, needless to say, and just cultivating their movement, including in helping with the violent coup attempt in Brazil and so on. So Bannon's still out there. Bannon's still doing his thing. And it's dangerous because, without any accountability, with Trump getting away with his whole pardon operation, and I do believe Giuliani, when Giuliani says that he and Trump were selling pardons for $2 million a pop, that sounds very much like them. The Kremlin clown car got pardoned. Paul Manafort, Bannon, Flynn, like all those guys got pardoned. Yeah. And they're still out there doing their thing, including trying to incite violence, trying to violently overthrow our democracy.
Did we ever find out who put up George Santos's bail?
We raised that question immediately on Gaslit Nation. We're like, who would bail this guy out? Who would put, three individuals? And we when that story broke, we were like, we need to find out who these people, who put up that bail, because Santos was, he was just on his way out. Like everything in the kitchen sink was being thrown at him. His long history of corruption and crimes. And the fact that three individuals were like, you know what, this guy deserves a second chance. Let's put up a ton of money to try to get him out of jail. And the reason why they would do such a thing like that is because he's clearly still useful to them. Like they need him in Congress. They need him voting for their interests and being obstructionist. And he clearly knows things. And he's somebody that they still see that they can cultivate.
But do we know yet?
We do not know. The New York Times and other media petitioned the judge to release those names. We should know soon. And one thing I want to point out is Santos might be a laughing stock to you, but if you find Santos a clown, like ridiculous, that's what Putin's politicians are like in Russia. That's what Putin's useful idiots are like in Ukraine. They are clownish. Putin himself is. Russians were laughing at him until he outlawed laughter. Basically, there was a popular SNL show in Russia that used to make fun of everybody. And one of the things Putin did when he came to power was he put somebody in place to get rid of that show. So Putin is like thin-skinned as they come, just like Trump. And they surround themselves with a bunch of fools like Santos.
Yeah, and this is actually, I just want to mention your book again, Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think, because it goes into not just Trump, but also Putin and Kim Jong-un and, just Bolsonaro.
Xi in China and
everybody. And the tactics that they use. In fact, when I was reading it, I was like, oh my goodness, I hope people who actually are wanting to be dictators aren't picking up this book, because there's a lot in it that they could actually use. It's troubling. I just want to remind
Trump studied Hitler's speeches, according to Ivana.
Yeah,
that he kept Hitler's speeches by his bedside, and I believe the friend that gave him Hitler's speeches confirmed that. But yeah, Trump held Hitler rallies. He studied the seduction, the how to work a crowd like Hitler.
Yeah.
So Hitler has been well documented. We have Harlan Crow, who is the puppet master of Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, collecting Nazi memorabilia and so on. These wannabe dictators are going to study the Nazis, for instance. Anyway, our book just shows. Our book really takes to task how easily dictators come to power with the help of a complicit media, a corporate media, from the power brokers and the elite, from the corporate genocidal class who want to pay less in taxes. They want to hoard their wealth. They want to really stick it to the woke left, the Gen Z, the kids today, thinking they can vote, and they will sell you out. They will, just to save some money in their taxes, to fascism.
Yeah.
And that's really what we send up in the book, are all the useful idiots that allow a dictator to come to power.
And I want to talk about that. I just want to remind everyone that you are listening to KSQD 90.7 FM in the Santa Cruz and Monterey Bay Area, your most amazing corporate-free community radio station. And we are talking to Andrea Chalupa, co-host of the Gaslit Nation podcast, co-author of the new book, Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think, and producer and writer of Mr. Jones this is a film, Mr. Jones, on Stalin's genocide, famine in Ukraine. I wanted to talk about useful idiots because one of the things that I've been seeing, at least in my community, I wrote an essay saying that I support the war in Ukraine, and I got a lot of pushback from community members who I'm surprised are not calling in to ask questions or to make comments. You're welcome to do that at 831-900-5773, or you can email onair@ksqd.org. But here are the people that surprised me so much were these journalists: Chris Hedges, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Jeff Girth, that whole piece in the Columbia Journalism Review, The Nation, supporting that piece, from what I understand. This is why it's so hard to navigate it's like there are people who are leftists, Code Pink and Medea Benjamin are, coming out pretty much. She just wrote a book, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, which is about this war. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to why you think these people are coming out sort of Matt Taibbi spent a lot of time in Russia, and he wrote a book about it, and you might want to speak to that. And I want to make sure we also have time to talk about what to do. So I don't know if you can, we've got till the top of the hour. What do you think about these journalists? And you can pick one if you can't, if it's too much to deal with all of them.
Yeah, it's... I would say, for instance, with Matt Taibbi, his time in Russia, he was part of a group of American men, young men, that went to Russia and fucked all the poor, beautiful Russian girls, I'm sure many underage. And that was a pretty well-known phenomenon. I knew a guy who went around with him in Moscow and confirmed to me that the blatant misogyny in Matt Taibbi's book, chronicling his time in Russia, which Matt Taibbi now claims is satire,
right,
was very much how they lived. It was just raging rape culture. And as much as he wants to try to distance himself from that now in the age of Me Too, that's who he is. And it's very much why he's on the side of Elon Musk and our corporate overlords, the oligarchs, the anti-woke oligarchs. It's the same corporate genocidal class that wanted to appoint Hitler chancellor to squash the left, to block the left, to keep the left out of power. And misogyny is a hell of a drug. And so, Matt Taibbi can't help himself there. And I would say, I'm somebody that I was born and raised in Davis, California. I saw Code Pink, Medea Benjamin speak at UC Davis. It was very life-changing. And I was very much of that anti-war crowd. I think there's like a picture of me with Chris Hedges and Cornel West at Occupy Wall Street that I took. And
wow.
Once all of my heroes started talking about a country that I dedicated my life to researching and writing about, and seeing them just get basic facts wrong and twist logic into place that would only work if Soviet history had never happened, that's when I started realizing, wait a minute, like, you guys aren't allies for human rights. You're pushing an agenda. And I think that is, what is that agenda? I think some of them are well-intentioned and they really, really want the war to stop.
Yeah.
But I think that just like during the time of Hitler, journalists like Dorothy Thompson, who had to take on Hitler, dealt with people like that, who were like, you're a warmonger. What did Hitler ever do to us? What did the Germans ever do to us? And even victim blaming. There was victim blaming against Jewish refugees who were trying to flee Europe. Nobody wanted them. Ships of Jewish refugees were turned away. So you do see victim blaming on the so-called anti-war left, trying to make it Ukraine's fault. Because that would just make it all go away, wouldn't it? But so what they're really doing is sticking their heads in the sand and refusing to learn from history. And history is screaming at us that appeasement never works. We've been trying appeasement with Putin since 2014. It has not worked. And he launched a total genocide anyway. And so the only option we have left is to give Ukraine everything it needs to defend itself and end this war as soon as possible. And that's the only way. That's the only way. And because we've tried everything else, we've offered land for peace, and it does not work. It didn't work with Hitler, and it's not going to work with Putin.
So we have a caller who has a question or a comment. Mr. Freitas, are you there?
Yes, I certainly am. And I'm on board with you totally 100% regarding the situation in Eastern Europe and the Ukraine. I want to mention three incidents in history. 1956 Hungary, 1968 Czechoslovakia, and 1980 Poland. So when I hear from certain people on the left that it was really bad that all these Eastern European countries joined NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, well, there's a reason they wanted to join. And I really don't think the United States was pushing them to join. I think that's a myth. They wanted to join because they didn't trust the Russian government. Full stop. And all you got to do is look at those three incidents. The Soviet tanks on the streets of Budapest in 1956, putting down the Hungarian revolt against communist rule. Same thing in Czechoslovakia. I was in 8th grade when that happened. It was a big deal.
Mr. Freitas, we're getting your comment. It's an excellent comment. I'm wondering if you could take the response off the air because we're running out of time. Would that be okay?
That's fine.
Thank you so much. And I want to just say that's where tankies, the name tankies came from. I believe it was 1956 Hungary when the Soviets sent the tanks in, or Czechoslovakia, and the tankies, as they're called, where they say, it's okay. It's not okay. Yeah, I mean, who would want to live under Soviet occupation? It's a brutal colonization, and it's a terror police force. And just ask people right now in Kar and Sudan. It's you don't want to be stuck under Wagner mercenaries, Russian mercenaries.
And another point you've made in your podcast is that the name of the mercenaries is the name of Hitler's favorite composer.
For a reason. It's fascism. But I thank Mr. Freitas for his comments, and I encourage him to watch Mr. Jones because it was made by Agnieszka Holland, who was in Prague in 1968, when the Soviets invaded, she was there. She witnessed that, and she was arrested for her activism and spent some time in jail. And I asked her what that was like, and she's like, they were sadists. The people running that prison were sadists, what they did.
Do you want to respond to charges of Nazism and corruption and repression of Russians? I mean, if we could, I really want to make sure we get to what people can do. But you could do, if you could do that in the next couple of minutes, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say Ukraine historically in recent years has been a hotbed for the Russian resistance, and so this whole Russian disinformation propaganda that Ukraine was abusing Russians in any way is simply not true. Russian activists, Russian whistleblowers would flee to Ukraine for refuge. And one activist in Kiev said to me that Ukrainians were keeping the flame of Russian revolution warm for when Russians were ready. They were working closely together for a free Russia. The second thing I want to say is Nazism. I mean, it's like, let's not forget that in my book with Sarah, Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think, we point out that Stalin and Hitler got World War II started by signing a pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that included a secret agreement of the Nazis and the Soviets carving up Europe together. And that's what they did as soon as they signed that pact. They jointly invaded Poland, which in September 1939, which launches World War II. They held a Nazi-Soviet military parade celebrating their conquest of Poland. And you cannot point that out in Putin's Russia today because you'll be arrested.
Yeah.
And so yes, there are Nazis in countries like Ukraine, just like there's Nazis in a far right virus in practically every country around the world. But if I were to wake up tomorrow morning and you were to tell me that we've switched Ukraine's far right virus Nazi problem with America's, meaning we now have the magnitude of Ukraine's Nazi problem, I'll be fully relieved. Ukraine has a Jewish president. We have a Nazi leader who has just been indicted, arrested, who might very well be the Republican Party nominee, which means he could win the Electoral College, a slave state monument, and become president again. Yeah. That's Nazi crisis. Ukraine does not have a Nazi crisis. America has a Nazi crisis.
So we need to.
And I want to say on the corruption point, Ukraine has been fighting corruption. They've been wonderful journalists since independence in the early 90s who have given their lives for fighting corruption in Ukraine. And instead of Ukrainians surrendering to corruption, every journalist and activist killed in the fight against, or beaten in the fight against corruption, spawned a whole new generation of journalists and activists. One thing about Ukraine, and I don't know where it comes from, it might be from like centuries of oppression. They have such a strong resistance culture. But when you do anything against them, like kill their leaders, kill their journalists, kill their activists, more rise up to take their place. You cannot kill them. And that's why so many Ukrainians rushed home when Putin launched his total war, when Russians were fleeing Russia. And I want to say all the help, all the aid that Ukraine is getting from all over the world, that comes with auditors, that comes with auditing. I applied for a grant, to a U.S. grant for media project in Ukraine. I didn't get it. It was very competitive. But as part of my grant application, I had to interview and include the name and contact information of an accountant who would audit my books. I had to do that just for the grant application. Yeah. So Ukraine does get audited. And I want to say all the aid from around the world that they're so dependent on is actually weeding out corruption even faster because all of these democracies are saying, we're not going to keep supporting you unless you weed out these bad apples. And Ukraine is doing that even faster than they would have without this war. Okay, Andrea, we are at the top of the hour. We're not going to be able to talk too much about what you can do, but here's what I'd recommend. A lot of this is covered in the podcast Gaslit Nation. A lot of this is covered, and you can get that at Patreon. You can get that at Spotify, all the places you would get a podcast. Get the book, Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think. And one of their most recent episodes is called Saving Democracy with a man named David Pepper, who is the author of Saving Democracy, a user's manual for every American. He talks a lot about what we all can do. We all have to get involved and engaged. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
from New York.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much to your listeners. Thank you, Amy, for having me on. Thank you to your team. I'm happy to come on again. This was so much fun, and I'm happy to chat anytime.
I would love to have you on again. And remember, folks, if we don't lose our democracy, we use our democracy. I want to thank Howard Feldstein for being on the soundboard with me today, and Andrea Chalupa, of course, and this amazing radio station, corporate, free, community radio, KSQD.org.